Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Faruk Rahmanovich, and I'm joined as always by Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
In this series, we're doing a chapter by chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book, A Young Muslim's Guide to the West. We'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and delving more deeply into the ideas within the passage, like what implications you can draw, what conclusions you can come to, and showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more closely. In today's sessions, we'll be looking at Chapter 9, Modern Western Philosophy and Schools of Thought. So, this one is a bit more up my alley.
Yeah, Mr. PhD in philosophy.
But Nasr does a sizable historical coverage of everything. So, trying to sort of walk you through this is normally this is a semester-long process. This is my intro to philosophy, and it requires about 400 pages of reading. Ain't nobody got time for that. So what we're going to do is I have, since he splits up this chapter between the sort of medieval thought and then modern thought, the modern thought I have explained as a narrative, right, as a story of development in about 20-25 minutes or so in a different video. So what I'll do is I will link that video below. We don't touch on all of the thinkers that he brings up. We do touch on all the major ones. So go through that, and that'll help you out with that sort of chunk. And meanwhile, what we're going to do here today is we're going to sort of delve into parts that are not just history of philosophy. Alright, so there is a part that for me I thought was pretty important and sort of goes with the introduction of the chapter. This particular chunk is taken out of the conclusion on page 179. He says, nevertheless, the ideas which have issued forth from various figures and schools of philosophy in the West during the past centuries must be known because of their great importance in the political, social, economic, ethical, aesthetic, and other realms. They, in fact, have created, for the most part, and defined to this day, what constitutes modernism and the worldview of the modern world. Now, I personally took this to be really important because very often we have this sort of attitude of like, well, that's not my major, that's not what I'm studying, that's not my field of expertise, why do I need to study philosophy? And the answer is because you can't understand the context that you're in and how you got here unless you understand the thought process that got you here, and that is this history of philosophy. And I think that that's to a very large extent what a lot of Muslims in the West are lacking, because we're sort of anti-philosophically minded anyway. I'll never forget, I was going to go teach a class to a bunch of high schoolers at a private Muslim school, and their principal told the kids, like, hey, we have this guy coming in on like a Wednesday or something, he's a PhD in philosophy. And the kids went like, isn't that haram? Right? And like this is all like first, second generation immigrants from across the Middle East, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. So I think that tells you something really important, right? Like, we don't study this, and as a result we're missing a very large chunk of historical context to the West. Like, never mind the role of philosophy in Islam and Islamic thought and development, but you can't understand the West unless you understand its history, and this is like the underlying basis of so much of that history. So I think that's a pretty solid explanation for why this actually matters. It's not the sort of thing you can just sort of ignore.
Yeah, sure. Well, how about we talk about why? Why do so many Muslim youth think of philosophy as something that is haram? Now, towards the beginning of this chapter, one of the things that Nasr says is that for most of human history, really, religion and philosophy went together. But relatively recently, at least in the West, there's been a decoupling of the ideas. So when they hear philosophy, they're not thinking religion anymore. They're thinking actually something that is in opposition to religion.
I think, and he talks about that later in this chapter, the idea of philosophy and then science decoupling from religion. I think that's part of the reason why we also end up with the conflict thesis for science, and I think more or less the same thing here is happening for philosophical thought, right? As if studying philosophy is somehow contradictory to the very act of being religious. So that's maybe a little bit of a historical reason why some people have those attitudes, at least. But in what ways do you think we sort of propagate that? Because that seems like the kind of thing you should be able to solve in like 3 minutes, right? Like you just go like, no, here's like all of these extremely religious, like essentially theologians doing philosophy, and there was never a problem up until roughly this point in time and in these places, and right, like that shouldn't take you more than like 20 minutes of explanation to anybody. So how is it that this problem keeps getting propagated, especially in like for purposes of this class, in the Muslim community? Not that I haven't seen plenty of my Christian students sort of have the same attitude as well.
Well, from the Muslim community, I think some of it could be attributed to a misunderstanding of Al-Ghazali, right, which is something I know you like to talk about.
Every time I tell Muslims I'm a philosopher, they go like, oh, didn't he write that book, Incoherence of Philosophers? And they don't really ask that as a question, they make it as a statement, as if like, oh, and therefore philosophy doesn't work. I'm like, first off, you haven't read that book. And I know you haven't read it, because I have. And that book is insanely difficult to read, because it's written for philosophers, by a philosopher, which is what he was, amongst other things. The technical complexity of his argument is psychotic, which is why the argument is so well set up. He's juggling like 50 things at once and is just sort of expecting you to keep up. So I know for a fact these people haven't read it, but they heard somewhere that, oh, Al-Ghazali did away with philosophy. They don't even understand the branch of philosophy that he was addressing itself to, because keep in mind that philosophy for somebody like Al-Ghazali includes logic, it includes mathematics, it includes natural sciences, what we call natural sciences today, it includes political science, it includes ethics, it includes aesthetics. Like, did all of those things magically shut down because of Al-Ghazali? Like, no, like you still got to do all those things. He went after a very particular branch of thought that was, in essence, trying to do philosophy as a way of displacing, let's say, orthodox Islamic theological thought. Right, like that sort of core Al-Qaeda kind of thing. They came in, they're like, well, we think, and he's like, well, your thought has nothing to do with this. And that's the part that he goes after, and there's a bit of the whole Asharite thought that blends in there, and that's a whole separate mess. But yeah, that's I don't think that helps, but like, where does that stem from? How is it that all these people who've never read any of Al-Ghazali, never mind that text, are, quoting that as sort of a philosophy is un-Islamic? Like, who propagates that idea?
I don't know who propagates it. That's a good question. One of the things we talked about, though, just a few minutes before, was the idea that there's been this decoupling. And so actually, if you look in the paragraph right before that, one of the things that, not before the decoupling, right before the lines that we are looking at here, so still on page 179, He does talk about here, rather, modern philosophies are usually born of the attempts of individual philosophers who seek, through the use of reason or empirical data, to create an all-encompassing system, which is then soon faced with the criticism by another philosopher who destroys the old mental construct to replace it with another. So there's this idea that philosophy means trying to reach conclusions that are different from what God has already told us is true.
I suppose you could use it for that. Or you could be like Al-Ghazali and use philosophy for, well, everything else. And you could be like, what's his name? Ibn Masada calls Ibrahim, the prophet, the first philosopher, because his reasoning of getting the idea of like idols are not actually God, and this is what God has to be like. That entire part is sort of pre-revelation, pre-angelic appearances, right? So like he reasons his way to the truth, and the idea is that everybody can do, well, everybody theoretically can do that, right? Because he doesn't do this as a prophet, he does this pre-prophecy. So I think maybe the confusion might be something like, what is philosophy? What is it that philosophy does? And to me, that's like asking, what does a hammer do? Well, it's a tool, right? Now, you want to build yourself a house? Yes. You want to build a birdhouse? Yes. You want to go build Habitat for Humanity houses? Yes. You want to beat somebody to death with it? Yes. Right? Like there's nothing in the hammer that is inherently either positive or negative. It is a tool so that you can do what you want to do, right? So it's a means of achieving something. The cool part of philosophy, at least to me, has been the fact that reason, and that sort of philosophical use of reason, it's not a cultural artifact. A good argument is a good argument in any language, in any culture, in any sort of a setup. It's entirely devoid of that, like, well, you know, whatever. Here in Mongolia, we think this way. It's like, no, logic is still logic, no matter where you go.
I suppose at least until you get to the postmodernists.
Well, actually, they start off with the idea of there is no logic. Logic will still be logic wherever you went. It's just that they denied that it exists. It's like saying, I don't know, elves are elves anywhere you go. Yeah, but elves aren't real, so you're kind of done with that whole line of thinking. He does bring up postmodernists, and I guess we can get there too. There is a point here to what Nasr is saying, and this is especially true in what we now call Western philosophy. The earliest known instance of this, like a person comes up with an idea and then it gets criticized and destroyed by another person and just sort of snowballs. You find this in Greece in pre-Socratic philosophers. So you're looking at like roughly 5 to 700 BC. Right, so roughly somewhere between 1200 and 1500 BC, let's call them the original Greek civilizations got destroyed. It looks like the reason why they got destroyed is because the what is today the semicircular island of Santorini was actually a mountain of Santorini, a volcanic mountain of Santorini, and it went kaboom, and it sort of obliterated everything. In fact, we have records from China about 2 years later indicating that they had this massive ash cloud come in from the west. So, you know, kind of a very large boom. And what happens now in this interim, roughly from, what's that, 1500 BC until about 700 BC, the remaining Greeks, the survivors, they lost everything. They lost written language entirely. If you're interested, you can look up. It's Mycenians and Minoans. Yes, those are the two original groups that we know of in Greece that we've sort of excavated out from under all this ash. But they had two written languages. We call them Linear A and Linear B because we're very unimaginative. But that language, which is the first written language that we have in Greece, doesn't resemble modern, or like what we normally call ancient Greek at all. It's a completely different structure. Everything about it is different. In fact, we've never been able to translate one of them. Like, we have a bunch of writing in it, we can't translate it. And the fact that we have complete mastery over Greek doesn't do anything for us. So in that roughly 500-year time period, what you have going on is the Greeks, who lost everything that they'd had, they get split up into these tiny little villages. If you've ever seen maps of Greece, it's incredibly mountainous. And so you have these like tiny little insulated communities, and then you have to be able to tell a story about where you came from, what the world is, all the rest of that. And this is where Homer sort of enters the picture. Homer and Hesiod, I can never pronounce the dude's name. And the stories they tell, that's the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's all about the Greek gods and ancient history and all the rest of that. And these stories must have, by the way, started relatively early, because things like what's being described there is supposed to be happening in Greece, but prior to the boom. And following the Homeric accounts of where things are located, we found the city of Troy, not in Greece, but in Turkey, which is actually what happens if you follow his description of how they sailed to there. We found a bunch of other things too. So there's obviously elements of truth plugged into these stories. So part of this narrative actually then ends up telling you something about what the world is like and how it's run and all the rest of this. And that sort of holds the Greeks for almost 500 years. Right? They just sort of believe that, and they're isolated, so it doesn't really, like, it's really hard to prove that, you know, the Olympian gods are just popping out of everywhere. Because you may not have ever met a god, but, you know, Bob from 2 villages over did. So the story goes. And, like, you're never going to check that because it takes like 5 days to travel there. There's like wolves and bandits and all sorts of other things. So that story starts coming apart somewhere around 700 BC. And it starts coming apart because it's internally incoherent. Right? It's like seeing a bunch of plot holes in a movie, right? You know something's wrong. Now the problem is, the Greeks had started building up what we think of as Greek civilization in that, you know, 500-year chunk of like Greek Dark Ages. And everything that they had built was built on the values that those Homeric stories told, right? So courage and all the rest of that, right? Like, what is courage? How should you properly display it? What is a proper way to behave in public? What are proper relations between parents and children? All the rest of this, right? So they built a civilization on top of this set of ideas, except that now people are starting to notice that those ideas don't work. And so you start getting people like Thales. He's considered the first pre-Socratic philosopher, and he sees that this underlying structure that they have doesn't work. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to come up with a different underlying structure that he could figure out, that he could plug in and keep society from collapsing when everybody realizes that the whole reason why they do everything they do is garbage. Now, Thales is well-intentioned, but the original Homeric account is not supposed to be something that Homer said. It's supposed to be the truth, because the muses of in the Greek pantheon, they're essentially little messengers, and they can't lie. The muses told him what had happened, and he just sort of passed it on. So that was an infallible source of information. Now that means if I don't agree with Homer, I'm not really disagreeing with Homer. I'm disagreeing with God. And there's this disparity of knowledge that is absolute. But when Thales decides to write his own account of how the world is, so that we know how to behave, he's not using the muses. It's not, this is what happens and the gods have communicated this to me. It is, Thales says. Well, guess what? Thales came up with his description of the world on the basis of his own thinking. Well, his own thinking isn't privileged in any way. Whatever he thought of, I can think of too, and I can equally disagree with it. And so Thales comes out and he says that everything is actually made up of water, different states of water with all sorts of sacred symbolism to it and all the rest of this. And then after Thales, you get, I think it's Anaximander, who says like, no, it's not water, it's fire. That's like 150 years after Thales. What happened is, well, because Thales said, well, I don't agree with him. And it's okay to not agree with Thales because Thales is some dude. I can always disagree with some dude. No privileged knowledge for him, no privileged knowledge for me. We're on equal footing. And after that, you go like, it's water, no, it's fire, no, it's air, no, it's this invisible ether, no, it's all an illusion. Nothing is actually changing. No, it's all, solidity of everything is actually an illusion. It's all in a permanent state of flux. And like this snowballs, right? So like that first difference took, I think, about 150 years, the first difference in opinion. After that, it's 50 years, and then it's like 20 years, and then it's like every other year there's a new theory of the universe. And this is the problem with this idea of like not being able to anchor your thought to anything that is outside of yourself. Because your only point of reference is just you. So, well, I think this. Well, you don't have to think that. You're always welcome to disagree and come up with something else. And now you have a proliferation of ideas that are all equally subjective and ultimately meaningless. Mm-hmm. So that's one of these really sort of crucial points that he's bringing up here. And I know he isn't spending a lot of time on it here, but if you pick up his Sefer Nasr's book called Man and Nature, I think this is chapter 2 out of 4 there. That is an insanely dense book, though. Like, read like a paragraph a day kind of thing. Because it was written for a bunch of other PhDs, specifically as a series of lectures. Anyway, so that's an important point if we're talking about philosophy being able to solve problems in the way that religion does. Well, if Islam says something, its status is anchored in something that is not the person even of your messenger, right? It actually comes from a source that is beyond human, beyond your ability to agree or disagree, or beyond caring on whether you agree or disagree, right? It is the absolute source of truth, and that's what you're anchoring your thought on. So if the Quran says something like murder is prohibited, and I go like, well, I think you can just go ahead and ignore me because my thinking doesn't really enter the picture of that setup. But you can't do that with a position that I made up, or you made up, or anybody else sort of made up, as a personal position.
And several weeks ago we discussed Sharia versus fiqh, which is relevant to that subject.
Yes.
As well. It is interesting your story about the ancient Greeks, right? Because there's a clear parallel to modern times there. Somewhere along the way, that this decoupling happened for us as well, right? Somewhere along the way, it stopped being we're talking about the West here. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being you know, the priests, the Pope, etc., saying, God says this, and everyone saying, okay, that's how it is. And it started becoming, this philosopher, Marx said this, Hegel said that, right? So when did that really happen, and how did that happen? In brief.
So that starts with sort of the rise of humanism, and oddly enough, there's a really old pre-Socratic Greek version of this that happens then. So you have Protagoras has this line, something along the lines of man is the measure of all things, of things that are that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. So it's only our standard ultimately that matters. There's nothing outside of me and you. But this starts kicking in with humanism, which is Nasr here locates it with Sir Francis Bacon, which is a materialistic utilitarian perspective on science, how to study nature that you may have dominion over it, that you may gain power. Right? It's a very Machiavellian, but before Machiavelli kind of reading. Descartes, actually, I think he's post-Machiavelli. Shoot, I'm gonna look that up. For me, this really starts with Descartes, and sort of happens accidentally for him, because we know for a fact that being Catholic, he didn't intend it this way. But he's trying to solve a problem, and the problem is, how do you agree on value statements on things? So if I say something like, this is a good table, that's my personal opinion. If you say this is a bad table, that's your personal opinion. And Descartes is a mathematician, amongst other things. The Cartesian coordinate system is his. And he goes like, let's just worry about quantities, because on quantities we always agree. And that sort of gets the ball rolling on the quantification of the universe. Now obviously he's just intending it for mathematics and then for some physics, but we then take that idea and we run with it. John Locke, the sort of founder of Western political thought, really takes this idea of quantification, and he says, like, look, how about you shouldn't enforce things that you can't demonstrate. In other words, that you can't quantify. So he uses this to push the idea of religious toleration, which is a wonderful idea. In essence, you can't force other people to believe things that you believe unless you can demonstrate that they are true. So math, we can demonstrate is true. You go buy something, you get the wrong change back, right? And the cashier can't go like, well, for me, 5 minus 1 is 1, so you get $1 back from your 5 that you paid. Like, no, you get to call the cops and they'll enforce math. But for things like whether Hinduism is true or Islam is true, things that you can't sort of boil down to this mathematical kind of proof, those things are all like whatever you feel like is fine, because we can't prove in that mathematical sense which one of them is right, so you have to let people decide for themselves. And that's sort of a good idea in Europe at the time, because they were committing genocide on each other over Protestant, Catholic, and varieties of Protestantism. So Locke is just trying to solve that problem, but now what he did is everything unquantified. And so you take that quantification, you go all the way up to mid-19th century, you introduce some Darwinism, and then the whole thing just sort of falls apart. But it's roughly, what's that, 16th, 17th century in the West. It's with the push towards humanism. It's the human perception of things that ultimately matter in relation to humans. That plus quantification decouples thought from some sort of an actual anchor that held it in place. So if you think about it, like if you have a boat with a very long anchor, so like that it hits the ground before the rope becomes taut or the chain becomes taut, that boat can still sort of sail all over the place while remaining ultimately tethered back to some sort of a central point. right? So if in case a storm comes in, the boat will move for like as far as the chain will give it slack, but then it will stop there, right? These ideas cut the chain. And yes, now you're able to go more places, but you're also not tethered to anything. And at least some of those places give you things like Nazism. And you're like, hey, maybe should go sailing that way. But there is no longer a reason not to. There's no system that functionally limits you in where you ought to go and not go.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the ancient Greeks for a moment here, how did that turn out for them? And what can then that tell us about where we're heading? Right? Because I think one thing really stands out about pointing out the Greeks and also modern philosophy, which is, you know, history can be pretty cyclical, right? By studying the past, you can get a better understanding of today and possibly even where we're headed.
I think we actually talked about this a bit earlier, although not in the context of Greeks. I think when we talked about the rise and fall of empires in one of the earlier lectures. So what makes a place strong, air quotes here, is the fact that they have some sort of a set of standards, things that they agree on, things that are valuable, and then the individual as well as the collective is driving in that direction, right? And with empires, just as with these other, maybe not quite empires, although Greece was like, it is sort of a Greek empire even if it's not under single central leadership. They lost that, right? By the time you get around to Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle, nobody really believes Homer anymore. Nobody. Except that their societies are built on the basis of Homeric ideas that they no longer believe in. So the natural outcome is that the things that were once valuable, we might do them for a while longer because of social inertia. It's kind of like Christmas here in the States. I think I mentioned that too. Half the people have no idea what Christmas is supposed to be about, and yet they're celebrating Christmas. Why? Because every year as a kid you used to like put up a Christmas tree or something, and so you have this inertia of doing that activity without any actual anchoring of that activity to any meaning. So the same happened for Greeks. They sort of kept doing stuff like building temples and whatnot, but the thing that drove them to behave in particular ways was no longer meaningful. And so you keep some sort of an external appearance of that while you do things that you feel like doing, which are now becoming socially subversive and undermining the whole thing, and you sort of cut your own legs out from under yourself. And the Greeks collapse, right? Alexander the Great, this actually happens during the time of Aristotle, because Aristotle was Alexander's tutor. Alexander the Great invades Greece, takes them over, and they're never Greece again in the way that they were. Then the Romans come in, and that's sort of the end of everything classically Greek. But the same thing happens to the Romans. They had this idea of like, this is what the Republic is. Here's what it means. Here's what it costs us to maintain it. And that's all well and good while they're still struggling to become an empire, and in the first sort of chunk of being an empire, and then people sort of stop believing in those values. They don't understand the value of those values, right? So for example, it used to be that only Roman citizens could be in the military, and that had a very particular standard of Roman military. And then later on they're like, just let everybody come in, and the standard drops, and then the people are unreliable, and they start hiring mercenaries, and everything just falls to pieces, right? And the whole empire collapses. This is, in terms of cyclical setup, this is exactly what it is, right? When you undermine the basis for your society, you will not have a society for long. even if you manage to quote recover, the way that you're going to recover is going to be by redefining what your society is. So, for example, I'm not expecting the Mongolian hordes to come charging on horseback through America anytime soon, but with the way that we've sort of undercut what we are and what we're about and why, I'm expecting America to either be a couple of Americas with different sort of ways of identifying, whether it might be split up into general North and South, or generally blue and red states, or whatever. Or we get the state together, but we have to sort of reevaluate what is America, what is our Constitution, what it means, what do we value, how do we structure that, how do we keep that from falling apart. Because the way we're headed now, we have so many internal contradictions, and things have a cost to maintain. So the question is, why would I pay for something that doesn't make any sense to me? So I have to redefine what the thing is, and then rework the cost to understand whether I should be paying it or not.
Right, and I think that even if most people can't articulate the ideas like that, I think a lot of them realize that a lot of these things are happening. There's a few different trends in our country right now. We've got, on the one hand, people who don't want to let anyone else in, or have very strict limitations on immigration. And a lot of that, it comes from the same idea, right? They're like, well, once the ancient Romans let barbarians in, that was it for them. You'll hear those kinds of arguments advanced. And so they only want to let in, quote, worthy immigrants, right? People who ascribe to American values, because that's how they now have to, that's what the foundation has to be now, is certain values that everyone agrees on, right? So we've got one group of people who are saying that. Then we've got another group of people in our country who are essentially trying to redefine what America is. And I think that you could argue that they're trying to do that to create a new foundation. And those people would probably be considered more, from a political standpoint, progressives.
So, just as a note here, the effort to redefine those values is an insanely dangerous one. Right? On the one hand, the reason why you always have, and you always do in every society, you have your conservatives and progressives, or liberals if you prefer. You have one group of people that's saying, like, look, this has worked so far, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You have another group of people that's saying things can be better. Yes, this has worked so far, but like if we retool it, it will work better. You'll have more of what you like. If you stay too conservative, you ossify. So you don't adapt to contextual changes as they go on, and then you sort of go into the Taliban mode of being, right? Like, let's just go back to whenever they decided they like things. If you go too far to the other side, you end up in anarchy. That's sort of various insurgency groups throughout Iraq over the past 17 years, right? Every little spot has its own way of thinking, and everything falls apart. So it's a different kind of death, right? You can either ossify to death, or you can anarchy to death. The best version that I've heard of these things is you have to be somewhere in the middle, right? You have to keep changing because your context is constantly changing, but you never change radically quickly, because everything in your society is so interconnected that you can't move any one thing without moving all the things. And so you don't actually know what your changes are going to actually bring about. So you move things, and you move them slowly, and you move them very carefully, and you pay attention to everything else, and then when you go like, oh, okay, crap, I didn't know this other thing was going to happen, let me see if I can fix that, right? So that you actually end up to where you want to be, not simply making the changes that sound good. But you do have to keep adapting. Now, that adaptation doesn't have to mean adaptation of core values, and it almost never does, right? Your core values, for example, let's say it's the Superman line, right? Truth, justice, and the American way. Like that's a core value, but how do you implement that in an ever-changing society is a thing where you're constantly having to retool it, and that's sort of going back to Sharia and fiqh, right? The Sharia part is staying constant. The fiqh is adjusting to the realities of your context, so that you can do the thing that the Sharia is intended to bring about in a functional way, right? So you need the conservative position and you need the progressive position in a way that is balanced, so that you preserve the things that need to be preserved, but you adjust the things that are adjustable, so that you can continue forward, so that you're not stuck in, whatever time frame you happen to have fallen into.
Sure. I've heard the analogy before of comparing it to like the gas and the brakes on a car. Imagine what would happen if the gas, the accelerator and the brakes on your car were to all of a sudden start arguing with one another and trying to convince the driver that the other one didn't need to be used anymore.
Nice.
You either have a car that goes absolutely nowhere, which defeats the purpose of having a car, or you have a car that it can't stop, and you're going to crash and die. And then once again, you have no car, in addition to dying.
Yeah.
Right, so it's the Chinese concept of the balance of order and chaos, right? You've seen like the yin and the yang before, right? I know that Peterson spends a lot of time on that subject explaining it, so that can be a good source for more on that topic. And one of the key ideas there is not to think of order and chaos, not to think of either one as being inherently bad.
Right.
To think you need some of each in order to be functional. And so if you have a society that is too orderly, the prescription is actually a little chaos.
Yeah.
Or, a little change in there. And if you have a society that's too chaotic, too much is changing, the prescription is going to be you need to inject some order into this society.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of let's say your body, if it wasn't for the interplay of order and chaos, you would be dead. Either way. Complete order means that nothing changes. Well, nothing changes means that no fluids can flow, no electrical signals can travel anywhere. Everything has to come to a complete stop. Well, then you're dead. Right? Complete chaos means like spontaneous combustion. Right? Or if you want to take it to the realm of things that we're more familiar with, complete chaos is random mutation onto cancerous death. Right? You need to be in balance. Things have to change. As a student, you need to keep learning. Every time you learn something new, you are changed in a particular way. But if I just keep dumping random factoids onto you, all you have is confusion. You don't have any sort of orderly way of comprehending things. So the idea of that chaos, like we tend to think of chaos as a negative, it's not. It's, again, we're back to that hammer analogy, right? It's what are you doing with it? Chaos is the change, and sort of well-managed chaos is what you're looking for in your society. Right? That well-management, that's your source of order, and then chaos is your ability to keep developing and advancing and all the rest of that. In one of the previous chapters where he talked about Islamic science and then Islamic arts and philosophy, every one of those periods, I mean, that development, that is chaos. Like, this is new ideas coming in and like reevaluating things and finding new uses and new ways to develop things, and we're no longer doing things just the old way. We got these new things. That's chaos. but the fact that they were situated in a highly ordered system meant that that chaos was well managed, so that it didn't just tear the society apart, it actually helped build it up. A difference between dumping a ton of bricks just at random onto a house or onto a space and actually putting them in order to have a house in that spot. Which I think is now enough analogies for chaos and order.
Well, I was thinking of one more.
All right, one more.
What you were saying about things being too chaotic actually reminded me of a short story by Anton Chekhov. It's called The Bet. And
you brought that one up before.
Yeah, it's a very good.
It's a good one.
Definitely worth reading. Towards the end of the story, the man who's been imprisoned and who's reading a whole lot of things. In the last 2 years, he just starts reading everything, pulling from various sources. The idea being he's trying to find some sort of meaning. And the final line of the paragraph says, he read as though he were swimming in the sea among broken pieces of wreckage, and in his desire to save his life was eagerly grasping one piece after another.
Yeah, when you strip out meaning, that's what people, like, if you've seen people that keep changing their religion, air quotes around that one too, like every other week kind of thing, like they're a Catholic and they're a super devout Catholic for like a month, and then they're like, no, I'm a Buddhist, no, I'm a Taoist. Like, each one of those is an attempt to fill the space of meaning with something that will make, well, life meaningful. And every piece that they grab onto, they're literally grabbing onto like a drowning man, grasping at anything in a storm. And it's like, nope, doesn't work. Next. And that's what there's a bunch of psychological conditions that sort of end up doing the same thing. When your idea of how the world is gets shattered badly enough all at once, you're sort of left in that inability to make sense of anything situation. That's bad. It's quite a lot to rebuild that.
So we see then, at least from how I'm thinking about this right now, a couple of options forward that are functional for our society. Either we've got to repair the damage that's been done, right? Essentially go back to when we had it right, which I'm not sure is even possible.
Nope.
Or there's got to be something new that comes in, essentially a new paradigm. And I hate just, I really dislike it when people's answer to everything is just, oh, they need Islam. Right? All of the ills could be solved regardless of the country, whether it's a Muslim country or whether it's here in the West. The solution is just they need Islam, right? It feels, overly simplistic. It's kind of trite. But at the same time, when we're talking about this subject here, it seems like, you need something that's solid here. And Islam obviously offers that. So what else is even really a solution at this point? Because is Western society really going to go back to the Christianity of 500 years ago? Are they going to invent something new? I know they keep trying. Secular humanism, one of the big ones right now in our time that appears to be developing into a religion is the concept of wokeism, or anti-racism, as a subset of that.
Yeah, but you already covered that. The three primary points on which that whole thing rests, which are entirely just unanchored to anything. Well, actually, you know what? That's actually a cyclical repetition, because this is part of what got Locke in trouble, or rather, what got Locke in trouble 200 years after he was dead, was this idea that these core moral values are just true. But that was based on stuff like natural law, which is a fairly Catholic idea. and he just sort of assumed that you could do away with your source of religion and ethics would remain. And he wasn't the only one, right? Like most of the Enlightenment thinkers had this bent to them. And I'm seeing these people do essentially the same thing, right? The idea of justice, like we know what justice is, and it is good. And it's like, you want to define that? Like, where exactly are you pulling that from? And the answer is, that's a shrug, by the way. Like there is no way of anchoring these ideas to anything because they've ripped everything else apart, which is the problem of using reason to critique reason. In the traditional society, so whether it was a traditional Christianity, what he calls medieval thought in this section, or whether you look at traditional Hinduism or Buddhism or Taoism or Islam, doesn't really matter. Every traditional society had understood that this is an absolutely critical thing, right? So reason is valuable. Why? Because it is. You don't get to critique reason. That was the idea. Because it's a starting assumption, it's an axiomatic point, that's just all that it is, and you're sort of done. And it was considered an illegitimate maneuver to attempt to, turn back, because it's kind of like this. You can, if reason is a tool, then imagine another tool. You can use a hammer to hammer anything except for that hammer, right? You can't hit that hammer with itself. If you have a microscope, you can examine anything other than the microscope, because again, you have to use the microscope to do the examination. When you turn an idea back on itself, it inherently destroys itself. And the reason for that is there is no longer a criterion by which you're judging. Right? If I use reason to judge other things, I'm saying reason is the criterion for understanding. If I try to use reason to judge reason, my criterion is gone. All that's left is personal preference. And personal preference always gets you into trouble. Like, pick a field, any field. Personal preference ruins lives and societies. That, by the way, is why authoritarian systems are a bad idea. Because you're ultimately relying on the personal preference of one person. And if that person happens to lose their mind, see the whole line of Roman emperors, then your whole society suffers because one person's an idiot. There's a neat point on page 170. 9 in terms of trying to answer this question, like, well, what do you do? I think, by the way, you can individually, I think people can go back to whatever, the Christianity of 500 years ago or more, right? Peterson, as far as I can tell, is East Orthodox. That's, but he's like really East Orthodox. You can, and I mean we've seen this. You have people that give up everything in of material possessions and wherever they live, and off they go to wherever to become whatever, right? So people move to India to go sit in a cave somewhere and meditate for the rest of their lives. So that can happen on an individual level. It's very difficult, but it can. That's not going to solve your social problem, though, because you need a critical mass of people to all move in the same direction. Inventing new things is going to have an incredibly difficult time ultimately working, because any new thing that you want to invent needs to have this sort of traditional anchoring that none of your modern stuff has. So if the modern stuff is going to invent a new thing, it can't invent its own antithesis. If the whole point is that you're not anchored to anything, they can't now invent an anchor. Right? So that's the particular problem there. Not that people aren't trying, as you mentioned, the whole mindfulness thing. I don't know if you've seen that. That's
Sure.
Sam Harris, which is pretense of ethics of utilitarian variety under the guise of universal morality. Again, doesn't work at all, but nice
I
effort.
want the ethics of religion without being religious. Right, so essentially what Sam Harris is trying to do is to have the ethics of religion without having religion.
Right. And no. People have been trying for a really, really long time, and
Right.
it doesn't work.
Before you brought up the mindfulness thing, I was thinking there's a lot of insert here in our society today, and I think that comes from that, right? The desire to have a new version of how things were before, right? They're realizing, hey, what's going on right now isn't really working. Let's go back to these set of ideas, or this time. Let's try to do that again, but within a modern context.
So that wouldn't be a bad idea, except that none of the people that do this, that sell it or buy it, understand what is the underlying set of principles for modern thought, which is what Nasr is trying to sort of show us here. Nor do they understand what the underlying set of principles is for that thing that they want to go back to. And that means that there's absolutely no chance that they're actually going to work out the differences. And frankly, axiomatically, those differences are unresolvable. Right? If you take somebody with a sort of postmodern bent to them a little bit now, what you end up with is the idea that truth isn't a thing, metaphysics aren't a thing, ethics aren't a thing, good and bad doesn't exist. And then you want to couple that with whatever, Taoism. Taoism very clearly says that yes, there is truth, whether you know it or not, whether you're capable of knowing it or not, but it is a thing. There is the right and wrong way to do things, and reality will smack you if you get it wrong. So how exactly do you propose to mesh these two systems together? Well, you can't, because they literally contradict each other. Now, if you're a postmodernist, that's not a problem, because logic isn't a thing either. So you can just stack whatever the hell you feel like. But outside of that insanity, if you don't understand the underlying principles of the thing that you're trying to go back to and of the place that you're trying to import it to, it's just an impossible task. And you won't even understand why it's an impossible task. I don't know, maybe one way of thinking about this in any sort of meaningful way is to think of it in terms of other problems like addiction. Addicts are very unlikely to just up and fix themselves on any average day. It takes hitting rock bottom before you go oh, this really doesn't work, I gotta change something. Doesn't guarantee that you'll manage to recover it, but the impetus for change, the willingness, because in order to change the current setup, you have to look at the last roughly 400 years and go nope, that's garbage. It's really, really hard. And you have to do that because the way out of it can't be through the same thing. You have to come up with a new thing. Whether you invent it or whether you adopt something that exists, it doesn't matter. The starting point is rejecting everything that you've built up so far. People will not do that voluntarily. en masse. So you have to hit a point where your alternative is worse. So the alternative to rejecting the entirety of the way that you think and understand the world has to be worse than entirely rejecting the way that you think of and understand the world. That's bad. That's really bad.
I think you got that backwards. It would be the way that you currently continuing or perpetuating the way you currently understand things is worse than rejecting it if you were going to try to change.
Right. Is that what I said?
I think you said it backwards.
Shoot. So,
right.
there
You got
there
the
we
idea.
have it.
Yeah. All right.
So yeah, I don't think that things are going to get better until they get significantly worse.
Right. Well, there's that. It exists in meme form now. I'm not sure if someone originally said this, but you can find it in meme form today. The idea that strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men.
Yes.
And maybe creating a cycle here. And I saw that and I'm thinking, okay, where are we now? I think we're well into good times create weak men, and well into transition from there into weak men create hard times, right?
Yeah.
So, how hard do the times have to get? Well, it could be hitting rock bottom, but what's rock bottom? Is it the point? Is it civilizational collapse, or is it the point where we have been surpassed? Because one key idea that still exists, at least among most Americans, is the concept of American exceptionalism. And if we're not the exceptional ones anymore, is that a point where people start saying, hey, wait a second, we need to reconsider all of this? I mean, you hear increasing alarmism about how, various countries, especially East Asian countries, are surpassing the United States in this or that. China is the big one right now. But you don't really see people changing. I mean, well, Chinese students are well outdoing ours educationally. Their test scores are so much better.
And they have been.
Yeah.
But it's not a recent phenomenon. And prior to that, Soviet students were just wiping the floor with us.
For all the good it did the Soviet Union, but
well, that's sort of, that is where leadership might matter, right? Like if you take your top physicists and then you make them farm turnips, right? Like it's, unfortunately, your physics departments are going to suck. No, I think, I'm trying to sort of view this, it always, to me at least historically, seems to be rock bottom. Or you just sort of get steamrolled. Greece got steamrolled.
Well, in that case, it's not even really that society anymore, right? They're not rebuilding themselves, right?
Right.
Something new essentially comes out of the rubble, like the proverbial phoenix rising out of the ashes.
What was the other thing? Romans both collapsed and started changing their attitude, right? With the varieties of barbarian invasions. I mean, Rome actually fell.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, right before their head hit the ground, they were like, Catholicism, right? And then they were out, right? So, like, they offered this tiniest sort of pull up for the next idea, which would sort of start dragging Europe out of the desolation that the fall of the Roman Empire created. The British Empire, though, I guess you can argue that the biggest changes came when they had a gun to their head, right? That's sort of in the World War II. Suddenly they're okay with colonies leaving. Or rather, well, I mean, that's not fair. Like 100 years earlier, they had, is it 150 years earlier, they started in on this idea of like, no, these places need to transition to self-governance. Like they'll still be part of the empire, but like we can't rule them from here. It's too, one, it's far away, but two, they understand their thing better than we would from here, and they started sort of adapting to that. But nothing forces you to reconsider your position like getting beat to within an inch of your life. So the idea of Nazis in Germany was going strong right up until all of Germany got carpet bombed, and then suddenly Germans were like, "Hey, maybe this isn't a thing to do anymore," because reality sort of smacked them in the face. So those attitudes, I mean, I know this sounds very sort of free marketish, but maybe the thing to do is you have to let things collapse. Because so long as like you keep helping them out, they're perpetuating the exact behavior that is collapsing them. Right? So, sake of argument, Greece is fiscally unstable. So long as you keep injecting money into it, the Greeks don't have any impetus to change their behavior, because money still keeps falling from the sky. The moment you go, tough, and you actually collapse their economy entirely, and then they have to go through like a generation of people at death's door on the street due to starvation, the Greeks that emerge are going to be very, very different Greeks. Right? That's your hard times creating.
Yeah.
Right? So it's. By the way, I'm not pitching this as a prescriptive thing to do, but this is a descriptive, as far as I can see in history, kind of thing. Again, though, just to jump to the Brits, they did, of their own accord and their own slavery, they paid out slave owners for the slaves that are now, because like understandably, right, if somebody had sunk their generational wealth into this as what was a legal process at the time, and clearly a moral one from their point of understanding, you don't want to go like, oh well, I guess your household and like the 10,000 people that rely on your products all fail. Right? They didn't think that was a thing to do. So like they actually bought out the slaves from all the slave owners. They prohibited slavery, and then from their own pocket, I found this mind-blowing, they put a large chunk of their navy on the coast of Africa, and they said, like, not only are we not going to engage in slavery, slavery is a moral wrong, and we are going to prohibit anybody else from engaging in it. A massive chunk of their navy sat off the coast of Africa patrolling, stopping slave ships. Like, if they caught you trying to smuggle slaves, you lost your life, you lost your ship. They took the slaves back to Africa, they freed them, people got to go on their merry way. Now, that's a change that happened that didn't require them hitting rock bottom. I mean, in fact, that happened sort of at the height of their power. So, maybe that's an example, or like a counter example to having to hit rock bottom in order to change your ways. Maybe.
Yeah, it's a good example because it was a few hundred years ago. But it's a lot tougher for things that have happened more recently, because it's easy to lose sight of how long some of these things can take. Right? If you talk about like how long did it really take Rome to fall? How long was that decline? It was very long. It was over the course of centuries. And so it's easy to say, well, the United States has been in decline, or Europe, or even Britain has been in decline, but for how long, really? I mean, if there are historians, 100 or 200 years from now, what are they going to say, like, about this time? Right? They might be like, oh, this is just a transitionary period, right? You guys have no idea what's coming up in a generation, right? That's where the really interesting times are going to occur.
Just wait for COVID 29.
Uh,
Alright, with that, we are at an hour 10. Thank you all for listening. If you got questions, comments, leave it in the comments or email us. And we'll see you next week. Take care.